On this episode of Newt's World, who needs a deep state when academia, big banks, corporations, and the healthcare system are willing to do what the deep state can't? Now that the Democrats are out of power in the White House and Congress, they are mobilizing in the shadows, working to make sure an election like 2024 never happens again. In his new book, They're Coming for You, Jason Chaffetz reveals how Democrats have been planting the seeds of political control using unelected institutions that collect and weaponize private information. They're Coming for You reveals the frightening truth about these institutions and how they collect, buy, sell, and share our data without regard for our privacy, our civil liberties, or national security. Republican political victories will ring hollow until this bureaucratic partnership with the nonprofit and private sectors is exposed and the power of the administrative state checked. Here to talk about his new book, I'm really pleased to welcome my guest and good friend, Jason Chaffetz. He served as Congressman for Utah's 3rd Congressional District from 2009 to 2017, and he is currently a Fox News contributor. He also hosts the Jason in the House podcast. He previously served as Chief of Staff in the Utah Governor's Office. Jason, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, honored as always to be with you. Thank you.
It's interesting. You were the only member of your 2008 freshman class to put the House Oversight Committee as your first choice. Why did you pick House Oversight as your most important assignment?
You know, back then it wasn't quite as popular, but in understanding the history and reading about it, what I figured out is that there had no bounds to their jurisdiction. You could dive into anything and everything. And it was also the committee when Abraham Lincoln came to Congress, who was known under a different name, but this is the committee that he was on. And it's a fascinating history of what he did. And so I just figured, you know what, until there's accountability, until you expose what's actually going on there, you're never going to move the meter. And that's what attracted it to me. And now it's one of the most, if not the most popular committee for new members to try to get on.
How did you see the job of that committee while you were there?
John Boehner was our leader and then speaker. I remember him telling us something that was very profound. He said, you know, you've got a great business card. You can talk to anybody, but don't assume somebody else is working on it. If you want to dive into it, dive into it. And that really rang true to me. And so I was just a kid in the candy store. I could see these things going wrong. The very first thing I jumped into was Barack Obama and I got elected at the same time. One of the very first things that he did in his first week is the spent brass from our military when they do training. He got rid of that recycling program. I'm like, what Democrat gets rid of a recycling program? And so I started to dive into it. And it was because he wanted to drive up the price of ammunition. And he wasn't wrong because it did have that effect. But that was the first piece of legislation I drafted. It's the first letters I sent. He changed it a few weeks later once it was exposed. And I thought, wow, okay, this is fun. Let's just keep going. You know, I dove into everything from Fast and Furious to Benghazi. I was the first member of Congress to go to Libya to try to sort out that mess, the IRS targeting. And what you realize is that the deep state is very real. It's very pervasive. And unless you expose it, you'll never fix it.
Given that you went to Libya, what is your take on that whole experience and what happened there?
I was there on the ground. They wouldn't let me into Benghazi, but they did let me into Tripoli. Very difficult to get in there, very scary to get in there. What I found was people that were there on the ground were in part the people in Benghazi, in part the people that were there in Tripoli, and they were frightened. They were scared. They had tears in their eyes. And what I realized is that Susan Rice and Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and Joe Biden and, like I said, Hillary Clinton, they were all lying to the American people. It was a total fabrication. And people that were there on the ground who were, believe me, not conservative Republicans, were so highly offended. And I thought, who's going to expose the truth here? And I fought that for years, and I still fighting to get all the truth out there. But what we were doing, how we were doing it, how we were part of the problem, I fought everybody you could possibly imagine to try to get the truth out. And I think we made a good deal of progress, but I still think there's more to expose.
I think it's important for people to understand that one of the great things about House oversight is it really lets you dig into how government actually works. And a lot of things that on the surface may not be obvious, but as you dig into them, you learn things. And one of the things that you did that I think is extraordinarily important, you argue that President Biden's Executive Order 14019 allows third-party organizations to register voters. And I think you correctly identify this as potentially very dangerous. But could you explain why you think that particular executive order is such a threat?
So in March, after President Biden is put into office, he comes out with this executive order, and I kick off the book about how he brought in all these outside groups. And on the surface, you think, oh, let's register people to vote. That sounds great, except it's not the role of the federal government. But what Biden and his cronies did is he weaponized it. He took, for instance, the Small Business Administration. He took the U.S. Marshals. He took the Housing and Urban Development, and basically took all those physical facilities, the federal employees, and then they targeted Democratic strongholds to try to maximize voter turnout and voter registration. And they spent millions of dollars. It was not a concerted effort to get everybody to register. They, for instance, went after people who were incarcerated. And that's where the U.S. Marshals changed over 600 rules, 600 rule changes to make sure that everybody could get their information. And there's another thing that happened. It was started to target doctors. It's called Vote ER. This is one of the most offensive things I found out, is this Dr. Alistair Martin decided to get this network of doctors. And what they ended up doing is they expanded to 50,000 physicians in more than 700 hospitals. It was funded by the Tides Foundation, Open Society Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And they just bypassed all the HIPAA laws. And these doctors were going around to their patients, including psychiatric clinics, and going to psychiatric patients. And their doctor would know whether or not they were registered to vote. Well, Mr. Speaker, once you figure out that somebody is registered, isn't registered, imagine you're in a hospital room and the doctor has this information and gets you to register, then you have all that person's data. And once you have all that data, then you can target them. And what they ended up doing, like, for instance, in Kansas with the abortion referendum, they sent 65,000 texts to patients that were in the medical system, all one-sided, all because Biden said, hey, we're not going to enforce that law. It was just pervasive. And there's nothing more disgusting than that, violating somebody's personal privacy. And what are you going to do? You're in the hospital. You're probably under medication. You're not allowed to drive, but you are allowed to register to vote, and they know who you are. It's scary stuff.
You know, and it's not just in medicine, but also, as you point out, and you really did a lot of research for this, the education secretary, 5 months before the election, sent a mass email to student loan borrowers, just sort of pumping up the importance of the Biden-Harris administration. I mean, are these things basically just campaigning with tax-paid money?
Yeah, that's what it is. We don't even know the total number of millions of dollars, but Executive Order 14019 was an executive order to leverage everybody in federal government, all the departments, all the agencies. They would take, for instance, 3,000 housing and urban development locations and use those as voter registration facilities. Do you think they were out there registering Republicans? No. Small Business Administration was going into 25 of the 28 Democratic counties that they had targeted to register people to vote. They went after Native Americans and did this. And as far as kids, we spent a lot about how they target kids and manipulate kids. Like, for instance, give out computers to some people for instance, in California. And if you're a parent, you could save $1,000 because your school hands you a Chromebook from Google. Sounds good, right? Except all that data, all that information, they get to keep. And one of the things that is stunning to me is how much the government is selling their data and buying data. So we have rules, we have laws against law enforcement. You have to have probable cause. You have to go get a warrant. You have to have articulable suspicion. But in order to get around that, what these departments and agencies, not just the FBI trying to find a bad guy, They will buy the data. And then once they buy the data, they feel like it's free game. And let me give you one other quick example. You're in Florida, for instance, and you got a driver's license. Let's say your 16-year-old daughter got her driver's license. It'll show name, address, telephone number, height, weight, eye color, whether or not she wears glasses. The state of Florida was selling that information and making money on it.
You point out from a Republican standpoint, one of the reasons to be very worried about federal employees getting involved is that in 2016, for example, 95% of federal employee donations went to Hillary Clinton. 95%.
That's exactly right.
So it strikes me that to think that the bureaucracy is even-handed is a fantasy.
Well, they're not even-handed, but they're taking this information. And it started with Operation Choke Point with Barack Obama, but it continued on with the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve literally in the last couple of days said they were not going to look at reputational risk when evaluating a bank or a credit union. So imagine a bank or a credit union, you're not in business unless the Federal Reserve gives you the stamp of approval. And what they looked at is under reputational risk is if you shopped at Cabela's, you were probably a conservative because you may have purchased a gun. You maybe bought a MAGA hat, then you are increasing your reputational risk. They debanked Melania Trump, Barron Trump. They went after the ag sector. The meat producers were having a hard time participating in the banking system and in some cases being charged higher rates. All of these things came into play, even automobiles. You know, your automobile of today is a rolling computer. And they're capturing all this information, what radio station you're listening to, how often you look in the rear view mirror, what speed are you traveling, how many people in the car, where you're going, where you're stopping. All of this data is then collected and it is sold.
You also make the point that you have private sector allies of the government bureaucracy. And one of the cases you cite, which is, I think, amazing, was that the Bank of America closed the account of a Christian nonprofit without any warning. That the Timothy II Project is a Christian nonprofit ministry established to train pastors around the world and has workshops in like 65 countries. But all of a sudden, in 2020, the founder gets a letter from Bank of America, even though he's been doing business with them for 9 years. And they said, you know, your bank account's now being closed.
That's why I say they're coming for you. Don't think they're not looking at it. And what they're looking at is not only who the depositors are, but any checks that are being written and making these arbitrary and always going in favor of these woke ideologies and against conservatives, saying, we just don't want to do business. You're too risky. Too risky? I mean, in this case, they had been a responsible citizen in their communities. You know, but remember, and I know you remember this well, but it was Kamala Harris herself as senator going after the Knights of Columbus affiliation of potential judges, saying, no, if you're a religious Catholic or religious zealot, then you shouldn't be on the bench. You know, that was out there in the public to see, but what you're not seeing as much is behind the scenes. You're being charged different rates. So, for instance, in California, if you get a speeding ticket, depending on a variety of factors, including your wealth, you pay a different rate than somebody else who sped through the same neighborhood who has more favorable connections to more liberal organizations and bank accounts. That's how crazy this has gotten.
The numbers are amazing that in our 50 biggest cities, there are 537,000 cameras that monitor about 11 cameras per 1,000 people. I didn't realize Atlanta has the most, has 124 cameras per 1,000. Washington has 55,000. Philadelphia has 30 per 1,000. I mean, you know, you make the argument that when you're tracking a criminal or you're tracking a terrorist, these are great assets. On the other side, that means virtually every American is somewhere on record as they walk around or as they drive or whatever. I mean, isn't that an astounding shift from the world of 20 or 30 years ago?
Yes. You know, in the movies, it looks great, right? And if you're chasing a would-be kidnapper or bank robber, it sounds great. But, you know, we don't collect somebody's DNA or fingerprints when they're born because you have a right, I would argue, a right to privacy. And the scary thing is there's a company out there, for instance, called Clearview AI. And I'm not saying they did anything illegal, but they have hundreds of billions of photos at this point. And what they're able to do is match those photos. What they do is they scrape the internet. And what I mean by scraping is anytime you post something up, if it's on Venmo, if you have a Venmo account that has your picture on it, if you have your Costco card, it's got a picture on it. If you have social media, if you're on Facebook, if you're on Instagram, your driver's license, all of this stuff, all of those photos get pushed into a file on you so that when you walk down the street of Atlanta, they can tell in real time that's you. And we tell the story of some MIT kids who spent less than $200 and through artificial intelligence and the processing, they can wear a pair of glasses. Meta's starting to get in this business. Ray-Ban's in this business. They can walk down the street and see a young woman and say, give it just a second for that computer to kick in and say, oh, that's Caroline. Caroline, hi, how are you? And then her bios, you're scrolling through your glasses and say, hey, you take that chemistry class at Emerson, don't you? And you went to that Alabama football game, didn't you? I saw you there. They tell this real life example and posted YouTube videos on how they could do this in real time for less than $200. That's where the world is going, and it's not a world I want to live in.
And to make it worse, when the federal government gathers up all this data, it recently has proven it can't keep it. I mean, there was a 2015 data breach at the Office of Personnel Management. Hackers got background information on 21,500,000 people, including fingerprints on 5.6 million. Apparently, I didn't know this. This is where your book is so valuable. In the decade between 2010 and 2020, the Government Accountability Office made 3,300 recommendations to government agencies to remedy cybersecurity gap. And hundreds of them were never implemented.
Yeah, federal government, bless their heart, I just don't trust them because they gather all this information. It's just a reality. They're not going to hire the best talent. They don't have the revenue to do it or the expertise. And so multiple times our data has been breached. There was one of the most nefarious was everybody who had a security clearance. Can you imagine how valuable that is to the Chinese and others on understanding every security clearance is out there and who they are? And then they can track you. We talk in the book about cell phone simulators. One of the brand names of one of theirs is called a Stingray. So I even did hearings about this when I was in Congress, and that was, like 10 years ago. And what these cell phone simulators can do is they can scoop up every telephone number within a radius of wherever this machine is. So for instance, the IRS had 4 of them, but now you can go to a data broker, which is a nearly $400 billion a year industry, and I can take Newt Gingrich's home address and I can buy a report that says, tell me every phone number that came within 100 yards of that address over the last, 2 months. And I can buy that right now here today. Where is that in my contract with Verizon? I never saw that, but you can do it and it's happening. And imagine how bad that is if you're an ICE officer putting your life on the line and what these yahoos are trying to do to those people. Or maybe you're the Sinaloa drug cartel and you're trying to figure out who the DEA officers are. People need to know this is happening.
Isn't that really one of the grave dangers that if you're an ICE officer and you're in the middle of deporting criminals, that you and your family are at real risk? And that's why they normally wear a mask because, there's a genuine risk that the cartels will not just go after them, but they'll go after their families.
And that's why they have to use phones that they leave at different locations. They got to not take them to their home. They come up with their fully masked up because, again, facial recognition. Once they get that face, then they can do a whole lot with it. It's The reason the book's called They're Coming for You is it's everybody that they're trying to just do. They have the ability. There are people that are studying your gait, how you walk, doing facial recognition. They think they can, with an 80% confidence, tell whether or not you're straight or gay, whether you're conservative or liberal. And they're using that to manipulate elections. So when you combine that with deep fakes, which is going to be a huge problem, not just for politics, but for young people and how they get manipulated and bullied at school, it's a world that is right here on our doorstep, and we better deal with it.
What should Congress be doing to ensure First Amendment rights and privacy rights in this world of overwhelming data?
I think Congress needs to do a couple things. One is, I think you as an American, particularly as a child, have the right to be forgotten. For instance, we allow in this nation, based on federal legislation, a 13-year-old can enter into a contract with a social media company. But what if you wanted to get out of that contract? I don't know of any other contract in the world where once you enter it, you can never leave, because the Googles of the world will continue to buy that information, or I should say, sell that information and be able to track you the rest of your life. And I think at some point, where is the consideration for the person who says, I don't want to be tracked anymore. I don't want my photo out there. I gave it to you so I could have some convenience in my life. But now I've gone past that point and I don't want you to continue to sell my data. You know, we all have those stories about, gosh, I was talking to my neighbor about a couch and now everything on my social media feed is about couches.
Even in your car, they're listening to you.
When we talk about vehicles, it is exactly that. What are you listening to? What are you talking about? What direction are you heading? Do you fully stop for right-hand turns or left-hand turns? It's all in there.
And I think Tesla, for example, which is really an information company that happens to have cars, I think they have, now trillions of bits of data about how you drive, how you turn, how fast you go, where have you been. I mean, you can literally reconstruct almost anybody off of the track of their car.
Congress, I think there can also be compulsion so that companies who are dealing and traversing in data have to fully disclose in a simple, easy to read, easy to understand, this is what we do and do not do with your data. And there need to be severe penalties for those who bypass that. But much like when they did food labeling laws, so I could tell how much sugar is in a soda or how much sugar is in my food, they could do almost like a labeling law for data. But then I do think that you should be able to get out of it. And maybe when you turn 18, your data should just be wiped clean. And if you want to enter into that as an adult, go ahead. But there are things like that. And then I think the privacy aspect on the spying really has to be put into lock. And they need to look at how our law enforcement is doing this, because we had hearings with the FBI, and with all due respect, they were doing things against the law. Once they have the data, they're buying it and they're selling it. That's what's killing me, is that they're selling my data.
Should the government be blocked from selling data?
I think without full disclosure or compensation, like, why should Florida be able to take my driver's license information and be able to sell that for a profit to the state? Why do they get that money? I mean, I paid to get my driver's license there. I don't live in Florida, but if I did, why should the government be able to have that as a revenue source? That's happening much more pervasively than I think Florida has now dealt with it, because it was exposed through a lawsuit. That's why it's public record. But there are lots of other bits of information about you that you don't know. And I don't have the full universe, but I think Congress could compel that. I think state legislators would be smart to run legislation to understand that. Here's the thing, Mr. Speaker. The private sector, when it's public, the public government, it's very opaque. We don't know anything about them, right? It's the exact opposite. The private sector should be the ones private. The public sector should be totally open. But it's not that way in our world today.
One small building block has been this proposal that Melania Trump supported so strongly, the Take It Down Act, which requires that if any image of you has gone up without your permission, that you can compel the Googles of the world, Meta and others, to take it down within a very quick time, because apparently it's a very significant problem now with artificial intelligence and with 13-year-old girls suddenly having pictures of them nude, although it's not them, but their face has been put on top of somebody else's body. And it becomes a real problem in bullying, psychological and social stress. And I thought this was a small but real building block towards creating a more civilized internet.
The First Lady's been amazing on this. The last joint session of Congress, they had that young woman in the audience, a guest of the First Lady, that had this deep fake and her face put on the body and passed around to everybody at school. And she was mocked and cajoled and contemplated doing something serious to herself as a consequence. Because imagine how it's tough enough to be a teenager, let alone dealing with the internet all the time and social media. There's got to be, I think, a look at this that's different for minors. And then the First Amendment issues and the Fourth Amendment issues, I think, are pervasive. And Congress needs to tackle this. It's not an easy answer, but the world's changing. And so many of these genies are already out of the bottle. And that's part of the problem, quite frankly. I supported, and I'd be fascinated where you are, Mr. Speaker, on this, but I wanted a technology assessment that was nonpartisan so that members of Congress could go to that group to ask them questions about how do things function, because there's only 3 or 4 members of Congress, House and Senate, that even know anything about the internet. To have a body of expertise so they could actually ask the right questions or know what to ask would be really helpful in a bipartisan way.
Let me ask you about one other proposal you've had. You proposed in 2017 to move federal agencies outside of Washington, which you said would be a real opportunity to get a more representative subsection of Americans working for the government. Do you think that kind of proposal can get traction?
Oh, it should. Look, I think there's key military and law enforcement that needs to have great proximity to the president. Do we need the Department of Transportation in D.C., or could that be better served in Atlanta or Los Angeles, or maybe the Department of Interior in Salt Lake City or Denver or even Wyoming or something? The Department of Agriculture, why isn't that in Omaha or Des Moines, for goodness sake? So I think setting it out, the employee base, what we find, particularly out west, I live in the Intermountain West in Utah, we're dealing with government bureaucrats who've never been out here. They've never been to the Rocky Mountains. They have no idea what our issues are. So the employee base, and why should they get all the employment benefit there in the greater Washington, D.C. area? It just doesn't make much sense to me. I think a diverse government, and again, Department of Education, first of all, there shouldn't even be a Department of Education, but if they had to have it in Florida or somewhere other than based in D.C. all the time. Each of the cabinet secretaries could have a small office. They have proximity to the president. I get that. But the rank and file, those millions of employees, spread them out.
I mean, there is a degree to which this has become an imperial capital. It has one basic industry. I really want to thank you, Jason, for joining me. Your new book, They're Coming for You, How Deep State Spies, NGOs, and Woke Corporations Plan to Push You Out of the Economy, is available now on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere. And I really appreciate you joining me to talk about it.
Honored to be with you as always, Mr. Speaker. Thank you so much. I do appreciate it.
Thank you to my guest, Jason Chaffetz. You can get a link to buy his new book, They're Coming for You, How Deep State Spies, NGOs, and Woke Corporations Plan to Push You Out of the Economy, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.